It's okay. I get all the glory now, right? What's that? Well, I blame Gadi for almost everything, so I don't want to abuse it too much. People will figure it out that I'm doing it. Though he is a fault for everything in the world, but, you know. Okay, so let's begin. So basically, everybody can see the slides? Great. So we'd like to understand how a better honeypot can be built. We're learning from the current work and understanding their related flaws and design considerations, right? So basically this talk won't be about finding buffer overflows or stuff like that in honeypots. It'll be more like the design principles and how we'd actually like to do a honeypot that works well and actually deceives advanced attackers like we haven't seen over the last few decades since honeypots have been around, right? By the way, just about the presentation, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm Israeli, so I don't really think anybody's, you know, trying to insult me or anything. I'm used to it, so feel free to interrupt. Okay, so basically, what is cyber deception and what is the honeypot used for? So when we want to do cyber deception, what we want to be doing is if we have an attacker within our network or within, you know, the public-facing assets that we have, we want him to do stuff that we direct him to do by his definition of being an attacker. And the most basic example is honeypot. So there have been many honeypots before. It all started out with Fred Cohen's Deception Toolkit. Then there were Last Spitzner, the honeypot projects, and many, many more honeypot efforts. And basically, what intrusion deception changes in the game is instead of trying to find that exploit or that malware sample, what we're trying to do is find the attacker himself, right? We're trying to target his method of operation instead of the technology he's using, which is something that is much more hard to be flexible on and much harder to change, right? And basically, this is what we want to try and do, right? As soon as an attacker is within our network or trying to find some sort of one of our public-facing assets, he doesn't know what he's looking for. And even if he gets entry into our network and he has some sort of information, it's like that fog of war that we know from video games. He doesn't know where he needs to go, and that way we can trap him to do what we want him to do. Right? And there's this Air Force concept called the OODA loop. And basically what it means is observe, orient, detect, and act. And fighter pilots act in that same process as do cyber attackers. They always try and figure out what in their environment is directing them towards the next step they want to make. And if we're influencing that observation period, then we can control their actions, right? So, this is the easiest example, like this is your grandma example of what's a honeypot. This is, by the way, a lot of people told me this is a really bad metaphor because the Wile E. Coyote always loses to the Roadrunner. But actually, as you later see in the lecture, it fits. Right, so why do attackers, why is this something that's very efficient against attackers? Why does it even interest us at all when we're defending a network, right? And the reason being is that when we're able to influence the attacker's methods, what we're able to do is hit them where it hurts, right? So the only things attackers care about is the amount of effort they need to do to achieve what they're looking for, right? And if we increase that amount by a lot, then we're impacting their way of operation, right? So, for example, if we capture their O-Day exploits or if we capture their malware samples, then it's very, very hard for them to be flexible and replace that easily. So that's the thing they're afraid of losing, and there we see that there's an economic change in how defense against attack works, right? So regardless of how you do it, in the end, intrusion deception comes down to something very basic, and that is the decoy, right? And well, honeypots are a private case of the decoy, and we'll talk about how they do it and what they try and do, and we'll see how they fail at doing that mostly. But it's very simplistic in the end, right? There's some sort of asset that the attacker is looking for, and we're giving him what he wants, and only the attackers will be interacting with that asset, and not any regular user, right? Okay, so, and the huge benefit from this is that, in theory, we'll never have any false positives, right? Because if, for example, we have this machine that we've put up on the network, and we're the only ones that know about it, nobody should be interacting with it, nobody should be touching it, as soon as there is something new on the machine that can happen from just idle traffic in the network, then we know by definition that this is an attack, right? There's no false positive, no other research required. We know this is a definitive alert. Right, so let's talk about a little bit what's the state of decoy technology. So most of the honeypots, you guys know the most prevalent and popular projects are what's called a low interaction honeypot, which we'll go into explaining. And they're mostly usable for malware and you know, automatic exploit detection. But they are very limited. And the reason being is they try and emulate a specific target. And a very well-informed or a relatively well-informed attacker is able to realize that. And the worst thing about planting an ambush is planting an ambush that the attacker can find, right? Because then by using deception that's obvious, you're not only losing the effect of deception, you're also risking your assumption that you're able to deceive the attacker. And for example, in honeypots, the basic example is if an attacker is aware of a honeypot, he'll do a lot of, you know, traffic against that while he's actually attacking a different part of the network, because that will draw your attention as a defender, right? Okay, so in contrast to low interaction honeypots, where they're just emulations of that target, high interaction honeypots are, by the definition of them, are the real machines, the real target that you can attack. But the problem with them is that if you want to get the attacker to attack them, you need to sort of get the environment to fit with that high interaction honeypot, right? An attacker is not stupid, and if he sees that something doesn't fit in its environment, then he'll realize it's not real. Okay, so is fingerprinting a vulnerability? This is something that we came across a lot while we were doing our research. So most of the abilities I'll be showing you is how to detect a honeypot. Some abilities I'll show you is how to also use that honeypot to the attacker's advantage in some way or another. And we feel that fingerprinting is not a code execution vulnerability, but it's more like it is a vulnerability because it's counteracting the purpose of the honeypot. Like, for example, one of the worst vulnerabilities you can find at Tor is to be able to reveal the original IP of the browser, not essentially doing code execution on the browser, right? So we feel it is a vulnerability, but there's a lot of terminology limbo in there. Okay, so now into technical stuff. So what's a low interaction honeypot? It's generally just a simulation of a specific network service, like SMB, SMTP, DNS, and more. We have an attacker. He's looking at the machine from a network perspective. He's seeing this machine with this specific service. He starts interacting with that service. And now we can monitor what he's doing because we wrote that service specifically for that reason, right? And a high interaction honeypot is the actual network service or machine. So, for example, a real SMB or SMTP or DNS server. But the problem with that is it's very hard to implement and very hard to monitor because then we need to realize how the protocol works and then, you know, try and read it off while it's real running inside the actual daemon that's running it, right? So let's talk about other people who have tried to detect honeypots previously. So one of the cooler websites is this. It's called HoneyScore. It's on Shodan. And something interesting about this, when we found it, we couldn't get it to say that something was a honeypot. As hard as we tried, we took like the popular honeypot projects, hosted them online, gave it the address, and it would still say that it's a real system. And then what happened was, we were talking to other people in the community. We realized there's this another honeypot project which is called Conpot, and what it does is it simulates a honeypot for ICS or SCADA system, like a industrial control system. And this is actually something that's been researched before, how to detect really like embarrassing stuff. So for example, the default name of the SCADA system that the honeypot would simulate was Mauser Factory, always. And as soon as somebody found that out, they changed it, but then they realized it always has the same serial number, which is something Sean Merdinger also found out. And for example, if you look for that serial number on Shodan, you can find all the world-hosted SCADA honeypots, right? And then we figured out, oh, now let's take that address. And finally, we were able to get HoneyScore to tell us something was a honeypot. So they're loaded in with, I guess, at least Conpot, but I don't think any other popular honeypot. And that's what we did in our research. So what we'll be doing is we're going through, I think, around 8 of the most popular honeypot projects, and we'll be going from the most basic one to the most complicated one in terms of closeness to actually being something that can deceive an attacker, right? So artillery is a very popular project. What it does is basically, as you run it on your machine, it selects a number of ports which have very known services, like port 80 for HTTP, other ports for DNS, SMB, and whatever. And then when somebody tries to interact with it, it just gives them garbage, like random crap, and then blocks that IP, right? And I have a joke which I say here, and it usually doesn't work, but let's try it anyway. It's like coming up to a girl in a bar and saying hi, and then she just says, I have a boyfriend, and runs off. Like you don't even get a chance to have any sort of interaction. Looks like this time it didn't work. No. Some courtesy laughs. That's good. Great. So as you can see, artillery, pretty simple, pretty nice to use, but it does nothing to try and actually deceive an attacker. And one of the problems that we found out was that it blocks that IP that's connecting to it without actually validating it too much. So what happens is if there's no IP spoofing protection within the network, it only takes 2 packets to make artillery block any IP that you want. And this also works on the gateway address. So you can just drop that machine from the network completely and it will not talk to anybody anymore. I don't even want to try and relate that to the joke from beforehand. I'll probably get in trouble. Okay, so what can we learn from artillery's work? Specifically that if we're servicing a port that nobody should be touching, specifically on a machine that shouldn't be servicing that port, as soon as somebody's touching it, that's an indicator of attacker activity, right? And now that we're attackers and we know how artillery works, how does that affect our method of operations? Now we need to consider that everything we connect to might be a trap. We need to check it beforehand, right? Okay, so now the next step is bear trap. Bear trap is pretty similar to artillery, and only that it does some amount of actual implementation of the service that it's doing. But it also is, apart from trying to actually, implement the service, it does nothing in order to hide its actual function as a honeypot. So, for example, if you use the FTP service, for bear trap, this is the default banner that you get. And I don't know how many landmines that have a sign here as a landmine work, but this specifically is a bad example. And we also wanted to find something that no matter how you configure it, still works. So another way we found out that you can detect bear trap is for every query on FTP, it returns just 530. This is something that for some of the functions for FTP will never happen by the definition of the protocol. So this is another way that no matter how you configure, Bear Trap will still be able to detect it. And specifically, here you can see an example of how it looks on a regular server. And also, problem with Bear Trap is it suffers from the same blocking IPs without even validating them in any way that Artillery suffers from. So again, if you're hosting Bear Trap on your server, then please be aware that it's pretty easy to remove it from any network. Okay, so what can we learn from Bear Trap's work is actually implement the service, not just return random data. And now from the attacker's perspective, we should be on the lookout for indicators of deception. So now even if we're talking to an FTP service, we should be looking at its banner, or when we're doing queries, we should be realizing if this is not the real implementation of the service before we actually do something that exposes us, like before, installing malware or connecting to CNC IPs or whatever. Okay, so now HoneyD. HoneyD is one of the more famous ones out of all the honeypots. What's cool about it is much more a platform than a tool. So it lets you actually design your own scripts that implement the specific services. And then put them in to HoneyD and use them. The thing is that writing those scripts takes a lot of work, and specifically HoneyD comes with a bunch of them that are default, and some of the default ones suffer from the same problems as we've seen before. For example, the IIS service, when it receives a specific GET, that its purpose is to find shell execution vulnerabilities, it always returns the same value. And as you can see, the problem with that is that this is a service that nobody's used in 16 years from the dates of the directory answer. So this is not very believable, and also it returns the exact same answer all the time. So the number of bytes free is the same, the serial number is the same. It's pretty easy to recognize. Some of the other scripts suffer from the same problems. In any case, it will be obvious to an attacker who's interacting with HoneyD that it's actually HoneyD. Okay, so a possible fix for the IIS example would be to return an empty dir list and randomize the timestamps and the byte counts and the volume serial number periodically. As you can see, trying to deceive an attacker becomes a lot of hard work because we're trying to figure out all these sort of minute details that we need to understand about the protocol to change in order for it to be believable. And what can we learn from HoneyD's work is that we should implement the service with no obvious indications. So all the indications we find in HoneyD are like implementation issues and not, purposefully trying to direct the attacker to realize that this is a honeypot. And now the attacker should be realizing that if a service is implemented only partially, like some of the commands aren't implemented or other stuff don't behave as they should, this could be a honeypot, right? And more often than not is. Next up is Nova. So Nova is actually a pretty cool tool. What it does is it takes HoneyD and a bunch of other open source tools which are not trivial to configure, and it takes them all and puts a graphical interface and gives you like very easy to use tools. So for example, you can just create a Windows machine on your network, a Linux machine, and just set them up very easily with wizards and get them going. One of the problems is that if we take a Windows machine and create it in Nova, then we can see that if we try and connect to it through the NetBIOS service, it displays as if it's an open port and allows a connection, but it doesn't do anything besides that. So as soon as the connection is established, you don't get any answers on any queries. And this is a situation that never happens on a Windows machine. It's either firewalled off or it's answering on NetBIOS. This is the only two states Windows machines could be in. So this, by definition, means this is a honeypot. And the possible fix of that would be to get the latest version of HoneyD, which they didn't. Or just, firewall off the 139 port. So what can we learn from Nova's work? implementing one service very well is not enough. You have to implement the package of services to make the machine look believable. So for example, they could have had a lot of other services that were really great, but then posing off as a Windows machine and not having that NetBIOS service just tells you it's not real. And as an attacker, we should look at the whole and be made aware when this set of services doesn't make sense, right? So next up is Kipo. Kipo is a really cool project. What it does is try and do something they call a medium interaction honeypot. And what that means is they try and host an SSH completely, right? So an attacker could log into that secure shell and actually use it and run commands, and they're simulating everything, right? And there were a bunch of different previous attempts to research how to find Kipo. Most of those attempts were patched off by the Kipo team, which are actually very professional, and they react pretty quickly to these problems. When we did responsible disclosure with them, they fixed it very quickly. And what they were trying to do is actually implement the wget command. And the interesting thing about that was they wanted an attacker to gain entry into the SSH and then use wget to download their malware sample and run it, right? Or their script that takes command of the machine. And they wanted to get that. They wanted to be able to enable the attacker to download it, because then it helps a lot with mitigation, right? So one of the previous problems with Kipo was that in the authentication protocol, it would act in a way that doesn't happen in any other authentication over SSL. What it would specifically do is tell you which protocols it supports before you ask it to. And this was a way to identify Kipo without even opening connection to it. So even Kipo wouldn't be alerted that somebody tried and connected with it. And it was clear-cut detection, but they fixed that, actually. And we tried and found more systems. So the way you connect to a Kipo machine is you just use the username root and the password 123456. But then if you write uname, the uname command, which tells you the banner for the operating system, it always gives the same result. And specifically what I'm showing here is from the source code of Kipo and Python. And what happens is that if you look up that uname, specifically that timestamp in Google, what you get is a lot of Stack Overflow IT people who are saying, I'm trying to connect to this SSH machine in the network. It's acting really weird. I have no idea what's going on. Can somebody please explain what happened? Here is the details of the machine. Please help me. Right? So even unaware, unsecurity-like people, when they're using Kipo, they realize something is off. And specifically, this is a specific way of identifying it. A possible fix would be either to give the actual machine's timestamp or randomize it from logical set. This is, by the way, the fix that Kipo actually did. And what can we learn from Kipo's work? The honeypot becomes a tool for collecting forensic data on top of detection, right? So, for example, knowing that we have an attacker on the network is much less valuable than knowing we have an attacker on the network and gaining the tool that they're using to connect back to machines or running, their malware or collecting tools on the machines, because that allows us for mitigation much more than just being, aware of that there's an attacker on the network. So how does this affect an attacker? Now attackers are worried of not only being detected, but losing their tools. Right? So if I'm an attacker, I have this awesome privilege escalation for Linux, and I go and I wget and run it on a Kipo machine, I fry that privilege escalation all day, right? So now I'm afraid. I'm not only, might be able to lose by the defender being aware, I might actually lose assets that I've worked hard on, right? And next up is Dioneea, and Dioneea has the best intentions out of all the honeypot projects, and this is specifically just what we've talked about. If I'll go through this, Dioneea's intention is to trap malware, exploiting vulnerabilities exposed by services offered to a network. The ultimate goal is gaining a copy of the malware, right? So this is the right objective. This is the cream of the crop, the cherry on the icing of the cake that you can get through using deception. This is what Diania tries to achieve. Right, and what this will give us is effective mitigation, and not just detection. So for example, in the past, Diania also had issues. One was that if you would do an Nmap scan of Diania, you would get the MS SQL service that they would host, and the MS SQL name would be Diania Honeypot MS SQL Server, which is not ideal, but they've fixed that since then. And something that's very interesting, and this alludes to the ultimate potential of low interaction honeypots, is somebody's emailing Marcus, who is the head developer, head maintainer of Diania, and he's saying, look, Marcus, I found a bunch of ways to fingerprint Diania, and we should probably fix them because then attackers are aware that it's a honeypot and not something real. And then Marcus gives this answer at the end, which is very pessimistic but realistic. And he says, well, this will end in a witch hunt, as there is simply no way to copy a one-to-one behavior of a certain stack. Well, I'm totally aware of the problems you point out, but besides from these three are just the tip of the iceberg. There is very little I can do about it. And basically, he's giving us, a view into the maintainers of the honeypot projects realizing what honeypots are good for, but the rest of the world who's using honeypots aren't aware of it. And that is, honeypots are very good against the more trivial ways of attack, but against advanced attackers, there's no way you can trick them using low interaction honeypots. So for example, we tried and find out another way of detecting Diania. Diania does an HTTPS service, and in the certificate, the issuer's name is Diania's website. Okay, so in different services, there are also other different problems, like in the FTP service, you can use 2 different passwords for the same user, which never happens in a regular login, and other ones, right? So what can we learn from Diania's work? Make the service exploitable to known exploits, because then you'll be able to capture the attack, because the attacker will be successful. And now attacker risks losing resources in a very dramatic way. Right, so now for Glassstaff. Glassstaff is very cool. It's a honeypot, which purpose is to emulate a website and be a honeypot for web-style attacks. Specifically, if you run it, it's very configurable. It can actually load in the whole file system for the website you're presenting. But if you don't do anything, you get this random web page, which just has random gray text on it, which was weird. And I said, okay, I guess nobody actually has that random generated web page. Everybody configures it well. But then I sort of distrusted what I thought. And as you can see on the bottom of the page, there's this signature saying this is a really great entry and this never gets randomized. It's always the same. And if you go and Google, look up that string, you'll find a lot of websites that have subdomains with that address in it. So it's very easy to figure out that they're Glassstaff websites. And specifically what Glassstaff tries and do is reveal /etc shadow and /etc password for directory traversal attacks, right? So if I go and I do a directory traversal attack, get this file, which is always the same unless I configure it, and this leads to a whole cat and mouse game of trying to fulfill the entire file system, which can be done, and also skipping over it just because of time constraints. So, and there's also another project called KF Sensor, which I'll also skip. And now the slides stopped working. Okay, so the last part I wanted to show, Matt, but I will probably not show. Okay, well, in any way, we'll be uploading the slides. The last part that I wanted to show is we did, using that Dioneea web certificate issuer, we did a scan of the entire internet for one specific day, using Scans.io. Oh, it's working? Okay. Nice. How I love the technical stuff. Hello? Okay. In the meantime, any questions? No? Okay. Well, in any case, we'll be uploading the slides. You'll be able to see a global statistic of all the organizations we found that host different honeypots, the countries, everything. This is probably the coolest part of the slide, but it's okay. Well, any questions? Okay, thanks.